Thank you everyone for having me today. I hope everything's clear and you can hear me. Okay, so today I'd like to talk about a particular story of Muslim printing. Muslim printing history is beginning to receive the attention it warrants with regards to the social, cultural, and intellectual facets of book production in the long 19th century. There's still various elements to the story that remain untold. So what I would like to discuss today is a particular moment in the reception history of mystical litanies, particularly prayer manuals, by tracing the material and intellectual history of Ḥizb al-Baḥr, which is translated as Litany of the Sea, by Abul Ḥasan al-Shadhili. Shadhili is a renowned figure in Islamic mysticism during the 13th century, whose teachings birthed the Shadhiliya tariqa, which is an order for spiritual learning in North Africa, particularly in Cairo and Morocco. So I particularly look at whether printing made different and new demands on this particular text. And the way I'd like this presentation to go is sort of, I'll talk a little bit about the venture of printing in the Middle East, how it began in the 19th century rather than in the pre-modern period. Then I'd like to talk a little bit about Islamic mysticism and who Abul Ḥasan al-Shadhili is in the intellectual history of Islam. And then thirdly, we'll discuss the book a little bit, particularly paratexts of it and its significance in the printed moment of the 19th century. So as an introduction, the burgeoning enterprise of the printing press in the Muslim world began during the early 19th century, prior to an established culture of manuscript. It began to circulate texts as a response to certain intellectual, economic, and social demands in Muslim history. In the 18th century, the manuscript production tradition began to be identified with an increased production of books on Islamic mysticism. And by mysticism, I mean a broader form of worship that emphasizes introspection and spiritual proximity to God. And this kind of form of worship became to be formalized as a religious science during the 11th century. This interest in Islamic mysticism in the form of text seems to have carried on during the beginning of printing in the 19th century. Therefore, this demand for books on mysticism bring forth a set of questions that need to be answered in light of larger framework of book history and 19th century mysticism, in terms of what was this demand mirroring in society, and particularly with how printing initiatives responded to these demands, either from individual publishing houses or from state-sponsored printing presses. So prior to the 19th century, printing in the Muslim world kind of circumscribed itself within religious and ethnic minorities, such as the Maronites, the Jews, and the Armenians during the 15th century when they relocated to the Ottoman Empire. In addition, we've had instances of Christian missionaries from Europe that had set up printing initiatives in Malta and in Beirut and in Halab in Syria in order to circulate materials for converting the Muslim populace. However, the Ottoman Muslims, on the other hand, relied upon script rather than print, as the textual practices of the two large scribal and religious educated classes kind of addressed the book consumption of the Muslim community and its political institutions. So rather than address why printing was adopted so late in the 19th century, it's been highlighted quite a lot previously in scholarship, particularly by Amy Ayalon in his book, The Arabic Print Revolution. Instead, I'd like to look at the period of adopting print in the 19th century in the Ottoman context in order to propose an understanding of printing that kind of contextualizes a set of broader societal systems and different actors that have shaped the Muslim experience of print once it was adopted. So my research aims to emphasize the role that people, either editors, patrons, scholars, played in shaping the printing initiatives. And this paper kind of follows in the footsteps of new initiatives taking place in Middle Eastern print scholarship by Catherine Schwartz, Ahmed Khan, Ahmed al-Shamsi, and Hala Auji, as well as many others. So then to get to the book, one particular manifestation of mysticism texts, widely printed in the long 19th century, is that of the writings of al-Shadhili. Al-Shadhili's life is related to us through the biographies compiled by his disciples following his death in 1258. So this is a pre-modern text that's being reutilized in the 19th century and printed widely in different communities. So according to these sources, Shadhili was born in northern Morocco, in North Africa, in 1187, where he studied the religious sciences in Fez, sought out mystical instruction from great Sufi masters of his time, where he later settled in Egypt, where I'm speaking to all of you today from, where he died in 1258. One aspect of the spiritual teachings of al-Shadhili are his prayers and litanies, also known as ahzab, which he left to his disciples. So the term hizb means part or portion, and this meaning comes from that this particular portion is taken out from the Quran, the holy book of the Muslims, where the verses are translated into kind of liturgical formulas of prayers. So these prayers are recited by many throughout the history of this particular book. The prayers have a number of benefits when they're recited or invocated by those asking to be warded off from harm, as well as other purposes dependent on intention or spiritual aspiration. So this litany was revealed to al-Shadhili, as from the sources it's related that on his way to perform the pilgrimage, crossing the Red Sea to the Arabian Peninsula, al-Shadhili's voyage had been delayed by a storm. And it is in that particular voyage that al-Shadhili was visited by the Prophet Muhammad in a dream and was taught the litany in order to recite it to safeguard his voyage. Following this specific instant, the text kind of began to be widely circulated orally and in script amongst worshippers in the pre-modern period. In its intellectual and scholarly mode, it also received interest from Muslim scholars through the tradition of written commentaries during both the pre-modern and modern period when we get to the 19th century. So the commentarial tradition, as well as the printing history of this litany, kind of stems from different parts of the Islamic world, from Turkey to India, as well as various parts in Africa. So through my work of compiling and cataloging these instances of printing the text itself, as well as the commentaries on it, it's also apparent that different locales in the Muslim world began to print this book and its commentaries. So the first instances of printing it was in the Ottoman Empire's capital, Istanbul, in 1848, followed by several instances in India, Cairo, Beirut, and Halab in 1884, 1890, 1892, and 1897. A particular work that was printed in several Ottoman state publishing houses is the subject matter of today's presentation. So the book is a commentary on Ḥizb al-Baḥr. This is called قلادة النهر في شرح حزب البحر, and it's translated as the color of explication for the litany of the sea. And this is a commentary on the meanings and attributes of the prayer. And this kind of medium of commentaries was used by our author today in kind of shaping the composition of his response to the canonical text, as well as how he kind of addresses it to his political and intellectual context of the time. So for the sake of brevity and time, I'll just focus on what we can glean from the paratext of this particular commentary and what the author's intention for writing it kind of tells us about the political moment in the Ottoman Empire's final days. So our author, Muhammad Abul Hadi Sayyadi, is the right-hand man of the last Ottoman Sultan, Abul Hamid II. And he's the author of various books on mystical texts. He was known for his close proximity to Sultan Abdul Hamid, so much so that the Sultan's daughter Aisha writes in her autobiography that Sheikh al-Sayyadi was seen as my father's foremost informant. This kind of proximity to the weakening Sultan in the end of the 19th century has cost our author much following the Young Turk Revolution in 1908, as he was exiled along the Sultan since he was seen as part of the imperial inner circle. In his introduction and preface, al-Sayyadi dedicates this commentary, which he terms this beneficial printed edition of the litany and its commentary, to his patron, the Prince of the Faithful, the Protector of Islam, the Imam of Muslims, the conquering Sultan Abdul Hamid II. So what we can gain from kind of the preface and the introduction is that al-Sayyadi places this printed edition within a larger project of printing intellectual texts that was patronized by the Sultan. And this kind of larger project included authoring and printing texts specifically on Islamic mysticism. So this is kind of a response to the increased demand for these type of books in Muslim society. And we'll just see how this kind of is taken on by the Ottoman state in order to circulate and disseminate state-sponsored texts on Islamic mysticism. So as you can see before you, Sayadi in particular had been tasked by the Sultan to write several texts on Islamic mysticism. And the kind of array of texts we have before you are either printed in movable type or lithographic. So particularly the first books getting printed were through movable type, and then the reproductions of it were done through lithographic printing, which was kind of cheaper at the time. So as I was saying, the Sayadi in particular had been tasked by the Sultan to write, edit, publish texts on Islamic mysticism that were printed in different state publishing houses in the Ottoman Empire, such as Istanbul, Cairo, and the Levant. So kind of in order to contextualize this printing endeavor.
That's 10 minutes, Mariam.
Thank you. So kind of contextualizing this printing endeavor into the political climate of the time tells us much about how the Ottoman Empire approached the technology of printing. So Sultan Abdul Hamid's reign during the last years of the Ottoman Empire had been threatened on two fronts, particularly from European ascendancy, so this is prior to the Great War, and there's this increased secular threat of the new European educated class spearheading the oppositional movement. So as a means of countering this secular trend, the Sultan, through his scholars, began to circulate a discursive image of himself as the protector of religion. So he kind of utilizes this increased demand for mystical texts in order to kind of circulate more religious discursive images of him, kind of sponsoring this new interest in intellectual history. So this is particularly present in the context of the Litany of the Sea getting published in different locales. So through the state patronage of this mystical text of al-Shadhili and his author, the weakening state kind of utilized the technological endeavor to disseminate a constructed religious image of the Sultan as a patron of religious printed production, reiterating his legitimacy as a caliph, a religious leader, through disseminating a much beloved text for the community. Even if it had not managed to safeguard him against the sweeping tides of revolt in 1908, the reliance of printing and its power of dissemination is one that is worth further study in this particular context of the Ottoman Empire. So the research is, as a wrap-up, the research's main goal of shedding light on the specific instance of printing is to underscore how it fostered a different kind of engagement with the pre-modern text in a politically charged moment, and for quite a different audience. So we're not just talking about a pre-modern audience, we're talking about how the 19th century either printers or audience were kind of interacting with it in a new context. So the paratext of the printed book, as well as its potential to be widely disseminated, had captured the interest of the Ottoman state for religious and political discourse. More still needs to be done in scholarship with regards to conceptualizing a print community, the institution, and the audiences during the long 19th century in the Middle Eastern context, with how they sponsored and patronized the survival of pre-modern texts. Thank you, everyone. Let me just stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Mariam. That was absolutely fascinating. Okay. Now we have a question from Richard, who's another one of our committee members. He says, what percentage of state printing was of this kind of mystical text, and what other materials were coming from the same print workshops?
So with regards to what kind of other material that the state printed, it was mostly religious sciences. So we had either, there was the printing of theology texts, and then following that we have mystical texts that I was talking about. And then once we get to the Renaissance in kind of the mid-19th century to the early 20th century, we see a proliferation of belles-lettres, poetry books, poetry compilations, and so on. In terms of what percentage, there's still much to be done about cataloging the amount of mysticism texts, but there were a lot. This is kind of what I'm working on as my MA thesis. So hopefully I'd have a good number to tell you once I'm particularly done.
Okay, and a quick question from me. What was the the readership and the print run? What was the audience for this? Were these relatively inexpensive popular editions, or were they, who were they pitched at?
So we have two kind of audiences. We have the either the European educated class, those who kind of traveled to Europe to get their education and then came back. But also we have this oral culture to the printed text. So sometimes these books would be bought by certain individuals, either the European educated class or by the traditionally educated class in religious institutions, and it kind of be read out in coffee shops, for example. So there's also this idea that books were kind of widely circulated in an oral sense rather than it being kind of a personal reading experience.
Okay. Catherine Mercer has asked, where is the Arabic Collections Online digitized project based?
It's kind of an initiative by the American University in Cairo, the American University in Beirut, along with different kind of American institutions, Princeton, Columbia. It's on. It's a website. I can send it to everyone in the chat box later.
Okay, I think that would be very useful, because Catherine's other question was that are they interested in Arabic texts held in other countries as well, around the world?
I think definitely. I think it's an ongoing project that hasn't ended yet. It's about how many universities kind of get involved in this project and make their collection open for digitization.
And we have one more question from Anna Welch. She says, thanks for a fascinating paper, Mariam. Is there any sense that the manuscript is a more appropriate method than print for the transmission of Sufi litanies in spiritual terms, or does the technique of production not have that layer of significance?
So there's this view that kind of printing kind of pushed back against manuscripts once it was produced. But then once we look at the kind of the paratext of the text itself, we see that from moving from a manuscript to a print, many of the religious classes were kind of encouraging of this shift, that even the techniques of editing a text is quite similar to what they were doing with the manuscript. So it's not a matter of was it a more appropriate method or not. It became much more easier to put out books for those demands for the text. So spirituality didn't quite play a role in it, since people wanted more books, and kind of printing kind of established this potential for more books to be printed.
Okay. Now, look, there is one more question, but I think we might have to move on in order to keep in to keep on time. Sharon Hunter has asked, Miriam, were there many women mysticism writers during this time? Maybe you could just give a brief answer to that.
Yeah, so I haven't particularly looked at them, but they are in the sources, especially the writers. They would kind of go to the publishing houses, the private publishing houses, and kind of spend money in order for them to print their books. So they are present in the sources. I don't particularly know of them, but they're there. They're definitely there.